Hey, good afternoon. This is Ben Hankin for MBA 510, our final chapter summary of chapters 15 and 16. Chapter 15 is all about organizational culture, which the book describes as it's a complex system that shapes how the work is accomplished and how the employees interact. And like a lot of the previous chapters, it's all built on a foundation of trust. And they can be understood via four interrelated levels. The first one is artifacts, right? And I talk about these four levels in my case analysis as well. And so the artifacts are the physical and tangible things in a workplace, so like the dress code and stuff like that, right? The second one is your espoused values and norms, right? These are the values and norms that are explicit within an organization, on posters, on your vision statement, right? These are the explicitly stated preferences, commitment to ethical behavior, stuff like that. The third one is enacted values and norms, right? And these are what employees actually exhibit on a day-to-day basis based on their observations of the culture, right? And there can also be a gap between the espoused and the enacted values. The last one of the four distinct levels, which you can talk about it, is the assumptions. And these are the values that have become so ingrained in the culture that they form the core of it, right? These are highly resistant to change, and they really guide the behavior of the employees instinctively. So those are the four lenses at which you can look through it. The chapter then moves on to the strategic importance of culture. Talk about, just like you built on previous chapters, hey, a well-managed culture is essential to long-term performance and success, right? And the relevance of uh, the strategic important culture, which the book describes, is shown in several key areas, right? So in performance enhancement, you also have a competitive advantage, right? He also talks about the power of strong culture and how they energize employees, right, without the need for formal controls. It just happens, right? There's also influence on discretionary behavior, right? So the culture guides the employees when supervisors are not around or absent, right? The chapter then goes on to talk about leadership's role in shaping culture, and this is all about my case analysis as well, right? So it says the culture is primarily shaped and maintained by the leaders of the organization, right, and requires consistent, deliberate effort over time, right? Consistently espousing, believing, showing, walking, and talking the values that you want the culture to espouse. Right? The chapter also talks about some key leadership tactics to influence the culture, right? So you want to communicate the mission. You want to develop and communicate the mission, right? You want to, if you can, select for cultural fit. In the military, I don't select who comes to my command. So I need to indoctrinate them and show them this is how the culture operates. This is why the culture is so important. One of the most important things you can do, again, is use daily routines and actions. Right? So you want to demonstrate the values through concrete, repeatable actions. Right? Also want to be the role model. You want to walk and exemplify the culture. Right? You also want to align HR procedures if you can, so that the promotion and performance is consistent with what you espouse in your culture. Also want to nurture traditions and rituals if they're good. Right? They reinforce the culture. If they're not good, change them or get rid of them. Right? The chapter also talks about some cultural frameworks, right? So the cultures of conflict. So you have a dominating culture, which is your active and disagreeable. You have collaborative culture, which is active and agreeable. Right? Avoidant culture, which is passive and agreeable. And the last one is passive aggressive culture, which is passive and disagreeable, right? The chapter also talks about cultures of inclusion. Right? So you have impact, right? So pro-diversity cultures. Diversity is a common theme throughout the entire book, right? Again, it leads to lower turnover and reduced absenteeism. The chapter also talks about how culture differs in today's modern workplace, right? Really through technology and innovation, right? So, what's the role of technology? Well, a lot of it is through intranets, right? Super powerful if you use correctly. Remote work, which is becoming more and more common. We also have innovation in culture, right? So, where culture is basically instrumental in fostering an environment where innovation can occur. This is highlighted uh, by the chapter, right? You also have the risk of stagnation, right? Some types of innovation that the chapter talks about. So you have radical or disruptive innovation, right? You have systems innovation, where basically create new ways of doing things, right? And you have incremental. The chapter also talks about how do you manage cultures. I'm not a huge fan of that word choice, but you can manage a culture according to the book, right? And you have three main ways to do it. So you can take advantage of the existing culture, right? Basically develop awareness of what's already in place and guide employee behavior to make decisions in line with that culture. Right? You can teach the culture, called socialization. This is onboarding. This is what happens in the military. What happens when new employees come on board is that you learn the culture, right? And you observe it and you learn it through the observed behaviors of the employees that are already in it, right? The last one, the hardest one, which is my case analysis, is all about changing the culture, right? It's extremely difficult. Right? It involves changing people's assumptions about what is important to themselves with regards to the organization. You can manage the symbols we talked about earlier, right? So create new stories, support new cultural values, shift the cultural values, right? Difficulty, the process is long, right? And the outcome, the great outcome, is its stability, right? So once you do all the hard work of changing the culture, changing the norms, artifacts, espouse values, entrenched values, you have new values that will become stable and self-reinforcing. Okay? You don't have to spend so much time um, espousing why the culture needs to change. It's just change, and it's self-reinforcing, right? This came across in the case study in Asana's cultural change, right? Moving on to chapter 16, which is change. Right? It's inevitable and continuous process. Now, we're not just talking about cultural change, but we're talking about not a deliberate change in culture, but the culture changes by itself. It morphs, it ebbs, it flows, right? It's inevitable. And the failure to adapt to cultural change, as the case study saw in Eastman Kodak, hey, listen, you can fall into obsolescence and you can no longer be around, right? Some of the primary drivers of this change, right? So a couple of them they talk about in the chapter is people, right? Technology, which Eastman Kodak, right? Information processing and communication, and the last one is competition. So a lot of the various forms of those all made up the case study of Eastman Kodak, which is super interesting. The chapter then goes on to talk about, hey, listen, resistance to change is natural if it involves wholesale change, right? Minor changes here and there, it's not so bad, but wholesale change is resistance is natural, right? And it stems from organizational sources and individual sources, right? And ultimately, survival depends on your ability as an organization to become a learning organization and to adapt. Right? The chapter moves on to talk about the imperative of change, right? And again, it uses Eastman Kodak, right? So, one of the consequences of Eastman Kodak for failing to adapt was they failed to adapt to the digital revolution, right? And they failed to act. And they had a lot of complacency, and they didn't recognize the huge opportunity they have in the digital revolution. Basically, with iPhone, right? So with a telephone with an embedded camera. The chapter then moves on to talk about some key forces that drive organizational change. We talked about these previously, right? But we'll expand upon them a little bit. So the first one is people, right? So you have generational differences: Gen X, Boomer, Gen Z, Y, Millennials, right? And it goes further to say, hey, some characteristics of the millennial workforce is they are more group oriented, right? They're optimistic. They embrace technology rapidly. Hell, my 2-year-old knows how to scroll on an iPhone. I don't really like it, right? But I'm not home most of the day, so I'll let my wife deal with that one. But they embrace technology a lot quicker, right? They prefer positive reinforcement at work, right? And they prefer flexibility. A lot of the telework things have catered to that, right? There's also increasing diversity. Again, a theme through chapter 1 all the way through 16 is increasing diversity. Okay? Another way you can influence this is via technology, right? So if you don't embrace technology, rapid obsolescence, right? So Eastman Kodak, we see AI now. Curious to see where a lot of companies are going to be in 5, 10 years, maybe 2 years, if they fail to adapt to what AI can bring, right? Use it responsibly. Also, it's like a self-perpetuating cycle, right? So you can circulate information faster, and you can have quicker responses to the problems when they come up if you embrace technology. You can also have some transformative innovations, right? So virtual reality, AI, the internet was transformative innovations, right? It's mind-blowing. And then they basically have altered our ability and the ways we communicate with each other in the rest of the world. The third way you can do it is by information processing and communication, right? So they've enabled new ways of working, right? So mobile and social technology, right? Flexible work arrangements, which we just talked about, teleworking, um, accelerated business cycles, right? So I mean, Amazon, I mean, you can get something out the door. I mean, 1 hour shipping, it's mind blowing, right? The last one is competition, right? So again, along with diversity, a theme across the entire book is global market, the diversification of the organizations nowadays, right? So the global mindset, rapid emergence of new competitors, right? I mean, I might not just need to compete with somebody in the next town. I might need to compete with somebody in the next continent. But everybody had access to all the sectors. I need to compete with someone else that is not in my same culture, language, region, area, continent, hemisphere, right? So that's the rapid emergence of new competitors, right? And it increases complexity. The chapter also talks about, hey, the added complexity of global change, right? So variations in cultures, which we talked about, the distance and time zones, and the cultural factors, which is again another theme along with diversity. The chapter then moves on to talk about the processes for organizational change, right? and it focuses on Lewin's process model, which has 3 steps. First one is unfreezing, that make people aware that they need to change. The second one is actually changing, is the actual moving from to the new way from the old way, and the last one is refreezing again, making the new behaviors in the culture permanent and resistant to change, right? Unless you want it to be. The chapter then moves on to talk about the continuous change process model, where basically each change is continuous. It's a process led by the top management. Benefits and cons of both, right? So it has a couple of different terms the book talks about. So the changing agent, the person actually responsible for making the change, it has some steps as well. So the process is, hey, listen, the top management makes the case, hey, if we need to change, the organization engages in the change. Someone is selected to be the change agent, right? Change is implemented, and then you do measurement and evaluation after that. The chapter then moves on to talk about organizational development, OD, right? And it says that it's a specific approach to managing change, and it's based in science, right? So behavioral science. Some key characteristics of the chapter talks about, hey, it involves planned change, not just off the cuff of a whim, but it's planned, right? The intention of it is to improve organizational effectiveness, and it's based on behavioral sciences, right? Some system-wide organizational development is, hey, listen, major reorientation, right? So structural change, quality of life programs is a big thing of it, right? And total quality management. Some task and technological change talk about is actually altering the work itself, right? So you can redesign tasks. You also have technological change that are redesigned to the jobs and tasks that you're tasked with doing, right? You also have group and individual change, and this is really talking about people-oriented change via training, development of managerial skills, right? So team building, right? From there, the chapter moves on to resistance to change, right? Resisting the change, and it is inevitable, right? Some of the sources of resistance that the chapter talks about, so you have structural inertia, right? Group inertia, threatened expertise, threatened power, and resource allocation. So the main ones it talks about. Some individual sources of resistance that the chapter talks about, hey, habit, right? Security. Some economic factors can be in play, right? The fear of the unknown. What is a new culture going to look like? What is a new job description going to look like? Or a lack of awareness, and social factors, right? The chapter focuses on some keys to managing successful change, right? And there's really 7 of them. The first one talks about is, hey, you need to consider global issues. Again, a large theme throughout the book with diversity, but the increase in global mindset you need to have, right? So the global issues vary widely across cultures, and they may not be universally accepted. They may not be the same in one part of the country. They almost certainly are not the same in one part of the world as the next, right? You also need to take a holistic view and understand how everything is interrelated and interdependence of everything, especially in this global world, right? You want to start small. Don't bite off more than you can chew, right? You also need to secure the top management support. I talk about this in my case study with my failure to get the CEO involved, for better or for worse, right? You also want to encourage participation from everyone involved, foster open communication. That's not rocket science. And you also want to reward the people that go along with you. There's a way to do that and a way not to do that. MAGA and crapping on all the admiral generals is not a way to reward contributions. The last one the chapter really talks about is cultivating an organizational learning culture, right? And it is, quote, the only sustainable source of competitive advantage, unquote, and it may be the rate at which your organization learns, right? So the advantages of having a learning culture are too numerous to count, and the chapter really goes into that, right? One of the ways you can be a self-learning culture is you have an after-action review, which is a different term, what we use in the military, which is called a critique. Right? The process focuses on 4 main questions that the chapter talks about. Hey, listen, what was supposed to happen? What actually happened? Why were they different, if they were? And what did we learn? Right? Critique is a massive part of the submarine and nuclear community. Right? We always want to flog or figure out what happened when things went good, but when things went bad. So that's the innate ability of a culture to learn. Right? You want to learn from failure. That is one of the last main things that the chapter 16 goes on to talk about. A lot of these are espoused in the submarine force, so it's very, very familiar to me. Anyway, this is the last chapter summary for Ben Hankin, MBA 510, summary of chapters 15 and 16. Thank you.